40-mile, Yukon Territory. September 1897. While 1,000 prospectors raced north chasing Klondike gold, one man made a decision that would brand him the fool of the entire camp. As axe blades rang against spruce and pine, as men sweated to notch logs for winter cabins that might keep them alive through 40-below nights, Lars Eriksson unrolled canvas. Just canvas. The laughter started immediately. Experienced miners, men who'd survived winters in Montana, Michigan, Minnesota, shook their heads. A canvas tent in the Yukon? The man might as well sleep under a bedsheet. Old-timers gave him 2 weeks before frostbite or common sense drove him into a real shelter. Even the Mounties passing through suggested he reconsider before the land killed him. But Eriksson kept working, and what he built in those September weeks looked nothing like what anyone expected. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat retention that men with decades of frontier experience had missed? The answer wouldn't just save his life. It would rewrite how prospectors survived the North. Before we reveal what separated his shelter from failure, do something for me. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And here's why you should. By the end of this story, you'll know a survival technique so effective that it kept a man comfortable at 68 degrees Fahrenheit inside, while his neighbors froze at 23 degrees Fahrenheit in their superior log cabins. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's see how many of you are dealing with real winter right now. September 14th, 1897. The first frost had already hit. Lars Eriksson stood 5'9", lean from the trail, 42 years old, with hands that knew stone and mortar from his years building warehouses in Seattle. He'd sold everything to join the rush north, but unlike the younger men around him, he didn't waste energy on speed. He watched. He calculated. He remembered things. The standard practice was clear enough. Every prospector with sense, and all the old-timers preached this like gospel, build a log cabin before the deep freeze arrived. Cut spruce or pine, notch the corners, stack them tight, chink the gaps with moss and mud, maybe add a layer of sod on the roof if you had time. A man could throw up a basic 12 by 14-foot cabin in 2 weeks if he worked hard. Add a stone fireplace if you found decent rock, or a sheet metal stove if you'd hauled one in. Eriksson's neighbor, Jack Bradley, had already finished his cabin. 2 feet of solid log wall. Fireplace built from river stone. Bradley had worked timber in Ontario for 15 years. He knew what winter meant. He tried to talk sense into Eriksson on September 10th. You planning to sleep in that tent all winter, Norwegian? Eriksson had smiled. Not exactly, because canvas won't hold heat worth a damn. You know that, right? First time it hits 30 below, you'll wake up with frost on the inside of that thing thick as your thumb. Probably would, Eriksson agreed. If it was just canvas. Bradley squinted at the pile of materials Eriksson had accumulated. Canvas, yes, multiple layers of it, but also burlap sacks, dozens of them. Dried moss, pounds and pounds collected from the forest floor. Something that looked like wool blankets. And strangest of all, a frame of young birch poles bent into curves rather than the standard rectangular cabin shape. What in hell are you building? A shelter, Eriksson said. One that'll stay warm. Bradley laughed. Not cruel, but the laugh of a man who'd seen greenhorns learn hard lessons. Lars, I like you, but you're gonna freeze. Canvas is for summer prospecting, not winter. Word spread through the camp. By September 16th, Eriksson's shelter had become entertainment. Men would wander by on their way to the creek, watch him work, shake their heads. The camp had maybe 75 men preparing for winter, and at least 50 had opinions about the Norwegians' foolishness. Thomas Reeves, who'd survived 3 Yukon winters already, made it official on September 18th. He stood watching Eriksson stitch layers of canvas together with systematic precision, creating what looked like a massive quilted envelope. That won't work, Reeves announced to anyone listening. I've seen men try canvas shelters. Seen them fail. You need mass. Thermal mass. Logs hold heat. Stone holds heat. Canvas just flaps in the wind and lets everything through. Eriksson didn't stop stitching. You're right about thermal mass. Then why? Mass can come from different sources. Reeves snorted. Name one that weighs less than a log wall. Air, Eriksson said quietly. if you trap it right. The comment made no sense to anyone listening. Air wasn't mass. Air was nothing. It's what you were trying to keep out, not trap inside. The Norwegian was talking nonsense, and the camp consensus solidified. He'd built things in Seattle where winter meant rain, not survival. He didn't understand the North. But Erickson kept working. His shelter took shape through late September, and it looked increasingly strange. The frame was a dome, not the tall wall-and-roof rectangle of a cabin, but a curved structure maybe 10 feet across at the base, 8 feet high at the center. Over this birch framework, he'd built something nobody had seen before. 6 distinct layers, each separated by a 2-inch gap maintained by horizontal spacers. The outer layer, heavy canvas, treated with a mixture of linseed oil and pine resin. Second layer, burlap, packed loosely. Third layer, dried moss, compressed to roughly 1-inch thickness. Fourth layer, more burlap. Fifth layer, wool blankets, the kind used for horse covering. Inner layer, lighter canvas, untreated, forming the actual interior wall. Between each layer, those critical 2-inch air gaps, maintained by the spacer system he designed. The whole thing looked like a giant's quilted tea cozy. Men walked past and literally laughed out loud. He's built an igloo out of fabric, someone joked. Won't last a week, another predicted. I give him until October before he's begging for space in a real cabin. Erickson said nothing. He finished his entrance, a double-wall tunnel design that curved inward, creating an airlock effect, and started on the interior. He dug down 14 inches into the permafrost, creating a floor below ground level. The excavated earth he piled around the exterior base of his shelter, creating a 2-foot-high berm that met the bottom edge of his canvas walls. And then he did something that finally made a few men pause. He built a heating system. Not a fireplace. Not a stove. Something else entirely. October 3rd, 1897. The first serious cold front arrived. Inside his completed shelter, Erickson arranged rocks. Not a fireplace, not a chimney, just rocks. Smooth river stones, each roughly the size of a man's head, arranged in a ring around the center of his floor. 48 stones total, weighing maybe 8 pounds each. Nearly 400 pounds of stone, sitting inside a canvas shelter. Jack Bradley watched through the entrance tunnel, genuinely curious now, despite his skepticism. You building a fire pit? Heat battery, Erickson said. He'd positioned a small sheet metal stove, the kind that weighed maybe 60 pounds, designed for Prospectors' tents. Not in the center, but offset to one side. The stovepipe exited through a carefully sealed opening in the canvas layers, with a metal collar preventing ignition. But before the pipe went outside, it ran horizontally for 6 feet, passing through a metal box he'd fabricated. Inside that box, more rocks. Smaller ones, fist-sized, packed tight. You're running the exhaust through rocks? Bradley asked. Capturing what everyone else throws away, Erickson explained. A standard stove throws maybe 70% of its heat straight out the chimney. This way, the exhaust heats these rocks to maybe 400, 500 degrees before it exits. Then they radiate for hours. Bradley frowned. The logic made sense, but still just rocks and canvas, Lars. Where's your thermal mass? Reeves was right. You need weight, solid walls. Erickson gestured at the 6-layer wall system. Touch the outer canvas. Bradley stepped outside, pressed his palm to the exterior. It was cold, ambient temperature, maybe 35 degrees that afternoon. Now come inside. Touch the inner canvas. Inside, the inner layer felt noticeably warmer. Not hot, but perhaps 50 degrees, 15 degrees above outside temperature. And Erickson hadn't even lit a fire yet. Ow! Each layer traps air, Erickson explained. Air is one of the best insulators that exists, better than wood, better than most stone. But only if you stop it from moving. Convection is the enemy. These gaps, he pointed to the 2-inch spaces between layers. These dead air spaces don't allow convection currents. Heat can't transfer through efficiently. The moss and burlap add secondary insulation, but the real work is done by trapped, still air. He walked Bradley through the physics he'd learned building cold storage warehouses in Seattle. R value, the measurement of thermal resistance. A typical log wall, even a foot thick, had an R value around 8 to 10. Each of Ericsson's air gaps, combined with the burlap and moss layers, created an R value closer to 6 per layer. 6 layers meant a total wall R value approaching 35 or 40. Bradley's cabin, with its solid 2-foot log walls, R value maybe 15 maximum. You're telling me air beats logs? Trapped air beats logs, Ericsson corrected. Moving air destroys everything. That's why chinking matters in cabins, why gaps kill you. But if you can create truly still air pockets, layer after layer, you build a barrier that heat can barely cross. The second element was the dome shape. Ericsson sketched it out in the dirt floor. A rectangular cabin has corners, dead zones where heat doesn't circulate well, where cold settles. A dome has no corners. Heat naturally rises to the center, then radiates outward evenly in all directions, meeting the curved wall at a perpendicular angle. Maximum efficiency, minimal loss. And the rocks? Bradley asked. Thermal mass you can control, Ericsson said. I heat them intensely for 2 hours each evening. They store that heat. Specific heat capacity of stone is around 0.2 calories per gram per degree Celsius. 400 pounds of rock, heated to 400 degrees, stores roughly 180,000 BTUs. That releases slowly over 10, 12 hours. Keeps the space at 60 degrees even after the fire dies. Bradley stared. The math was beyond him, but the principle was clear. Ericsson hadn't rejected thermal mass. He just stored it differently. Concentrated, controllable, and surrounded by insulation so effective the heat couldn't escape. You really think this'll work? I know the physics works, Ericsson said. Whether I built it right, we'll find out. October in the Yukon brought temperatures down to the teens at night, occasionally touching 0. For most prospectors, this was just the warm-up, the test before the real winter arrived. Cabins with good fireplaces stayed comfortable enough if you kept feeding wood. Men burned through cords of spruce, keeping fires going 12, 16 hours a day. Ericsson lit his small stove for 2 hours each evening, from 6 to 8 p.m. He'd load it with dense, dry wood, maybe 15 pounds total, and let it burn hot and fast. The stovepipe rocks would glow dull red. The floor rocks would heat to temperatures painful to touch. Then he'd let the fire die completely. His neighbors watched smoke rise from his chimney for 2 hours, then nothing. Surely the space would turn to an icebox by midnight. But when Jack Bradley checked on him at 11 p.m. on October 15th, temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. He found Ericsson reading by candlelight in shirt sleeves. Bradley's own cabin, with a fire still burning, required him to wear a wool coat indoors. What's your temperature in here? Ericsson checked a thermometer hanging from the dome's center. 64 degrees. Bradley's cabin, with active fire, maybe 52. That doesn't make sense. Makes perfect sense, Ericsson said calmly. Heat stays where you trap it. Word started spreading, but most men still dismissed it. October wasn't a test. Wait until January. Wait until 40 below. Wait until the real cold came. Then canvas would fail, they assured each other. Then the Norwegian would learn. January 11th, 1898. The mercury dropped like a stone. It started with the wind, a north wind that came screaming down from the Arctic, bringing air so cold it seemed solid. By sunset on January 11th, thermometers across 40 Mile showed 22 below zero. By midnight, 31 below. By dawn on January 12th, 39 below 0 Fahrenheit. Men who'd survived Yukon winters said they'd never felt cold like this. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the duration, the relentlessness. This wasn't a cold snap that would break in 2 days. The wind kept coming, and the temperature kept falling. January 12th, noon, 41 below. In the log cabins scattered across the camp, men burned wood at a desperate pace. Jack Bradley fed his fireplace every 40 minutes. He wore 2 layers of wool, a fur coat on top, and still felt cold penetrating through the log walls. His interior temperature, with the fire roaring, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees above freezing. In a cabin with a fire going continuously. Thomas Reeves, the three-winter veteran, fared slightly better. He'd built his cabin with extra chinking and had a better stone fireplace with more thermal mass. His interior held at 41 degrees, but he was burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. He'd calculated his remaining supply. At this consumption level, he'd run out by mid-February, and winter ran through March, sometimes into April. Other cabins reported similar figures. Interior temperatures ranging from 28 to 43 degrees, all with fires burning constantly. Men wore every piece of clothing they owned. Frostbite became common on fingers and toes despite being indoors. Water froze in cups within an hour of being poured. The cold didn't just surround the cabins. It invaded them, squeezed through every microscopic gap, radiated through the log walls themselves. On the evening of January 12th, as the temperature touched 43 below zero, Jack Bradley made his way to Ericsson's shelter. He had to know, was the Norwegian still alive? Had he already frozen, too proud to ask for help? The shelter sat in its clearing, covered with a layer of frost that made the outer canvas look like white fur. No smoke rose from the chimney. Ericsson's fire had gone out hours ago, as it did every night. Bradley called out, "Lars, you alive in there?" A pause. Then Ericsson's voice, calm and clear, "Come in, Jack. Door's not locked." Bradley pushed through the entrance tunnel and stopped. The interior was warm. Not just warmer than outside, not just above freezing. Actually warm. He could feel it on his face immediately, a gentle, radiant heat coming from every direction. He pulled off his outer gloves, something he hadn't been able to do in his own cabin. Ericsson sat at a small table, writing in a journal. He wore a single wool shirt, no coat, no hat. His water bucket held liquid water. Bradley stared at the thermometer hanging in the dome's center. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 43 below zero. Difference, 111 degrees. Ow! Bradley's voice came out as a whisper. Ericsson gestured to the rocks on the floor. Touch one. Bradley knelt, held his hand near one of the river stones. Heat radiated upward, not burning hot anymore, but steady, persistent warmth. He checked his pocket watch. 8:47 p.m. Ericsson's fire had been out since 8 p.m., as always. 47 minutes of heat radiation, still going strong. They'll hold temperature for another 4, maybe 5 hours, Ericsson said. Long enough to sleep through. Then I'll wake up, light a small fire for morning coffee, heat them again. 2 hours of fire per day. That's all I need. Bradley looked around the space more carefully now. The inner canvas wall showed no frost, no ice buildup. The air felt dry and comfortable, a stark contrast to his own cabin, where moisture from breathing froze on the walls, creating ice layers that wouldn't melt until spring. Your wood consumption? Maybe 20 pounds per day, Ericsson said. 15 if the weather's milder. Bradley was burning through 120 pounds per day, minimum, 6 times more, and his cabin was still barely habitable. The walls. Bradley touched the inner canvas, then worked his way outward through the entrance tunnel, feeling each layer. The outer canvas was frozen solid, frost-covered, the same temperature as the ambient air. But each layer inward was progressively warmer. By the 4th layer, the canvas was above freezing. The temperature gradient was so gradual, so controlled, that condensation had nowhere to form. He came back inside, sat down heavily on Ericsson's spare stool. We were wrong, he said simply. About canvas, yes, Ericsson agreed. But not about thermal mass, not about insulation. You just assumed those principles required logs and stone. They don't. They require understanding. January 14th, 1898. The cold held firm at 38 below zero. Jack Bradley organized a measurement survey. If what Ericsson had achieved was real, and Bradley could no longer doubt it, then the camp needed to know exactly how real. He visited 12 cabins, recording interior temperatures at 2 p.m., when the sun, what little of it appeared, was highest. He also tracked wood consumption over a 24-hour period. The data was stark. Cabin temperatures, exterior temp, 38 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Bradley's cabin, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning continuously, Reeves' cabin. 43 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning continuously. Murphy's dugout cabin. 41 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning continuously. Peterson's cabin. 31 degrees Fahrenheit, fire burning continuously. Average across 12 cabins. 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Erickson's shelter. 71 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire for past 6 hours. Temperature differential from exterior. Average cabin. 75 degrees warmer than outside. Erickson's shelter. 109 degrees warmer than outside. Wood consumption. 24-hour period. Average cabin. 115 pounds of dry wood. Erickson's shelter. 22 pounds of dry wood. Bradley presented these figures to Thomas Reeves, who checked them twice, then a third time. That's a 45-degree difference, Reeves said slowly. His shelter is running 45 degrees warmer than our cabins, on 1/5 the fuel. 1/5, Bradley confirmed. Ow! They went to Erickson's shelter together that evening. Erickson, who'd remained humble throughout the mockery and remained humble now in vindication, walked them through every principle. 3 elements working together, he explained: insulation, thermal mass, and geometry. Element 1. Multi-layer insulation. Erickson had them feel each layer again, this time explaining the R value in simpler terms. Every layer of trapped, still air is like adding another blanket. But blankets compress, lose their air gaps. This system maintains the gaps rigidly. The heat trying to escape from inside has to cross 6 separate air barriers, plus the moss and burlap. By the time it reaches the outer canvas, it's lost 95% of its energy. He'd done calculations. A single-layer canvas tent loses heat through 3 mechanisms: conduction through the fabric, convection as air currents move across both surfaces, and radiation as infrared energy passes through. Combined heat loss rate: approximately 80 BTUs per square foot per hour at a 40-degree temperature differential. His 6-layer system reduced that to roughly 4 BTUs per square foot per hour, a 95% reduction in heat loss. Element 2. Controlled thermal mass. The rock system wasn't random. Erickson had selected river stones specifically. They had higher density and better heat retention than volcanic or sedimentary rocks. The total mass of 384 pounds, when heated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit during his evening fire, stored approximately 180,000 BTUs. His shelter's volume was roughly 565 cubic feet. To maintain that space at 70 degrees Fahrenheit when the exterior was 40 below, a 110-degree differential, he needed to replace roughly 800 BTUs per hour, accounting for minor air leaks, the entrance tunnel, and the stovepipe penetration. 180,000 BTUs stored, divided by 800 BTUs consumed per hour, meant his rocks could maintain comfortable temperature for 225 hours, over 9 days. In practice, he refreshed the heat daily, but the math showed the massive buffer he'd created. Element 3. Dome geometry. Reeves understood this one instinctively. No corners means no dead air, no cold spots. Exactly, Erickson confirmed. A rectangular cabin has 8 corners where heat doesn't circulate. Cold air settles in the floor corners, creating zones that could be 20 degrees colder than the center of the room. You end up heating the space unevenly, wasting energy trying to warm the cold corners that just sink heat constantly. The dome created a natural convection current. Warm air rose to the center peak, then circulated outward and downward along the curved walls, creating a gentle, continuous flow. Every cubic foot of air stayed in motion, maintaining even temperature throughout. His floor-level temperature was only 3 degrees cooler than the peak temperature, versus 15 or 20 degrees in a rectangular cabin. Bradley asked the question that was bothering him most: why didn't anyone figure this out before? Erickson smiled. People did. The Sami have used layered fabric shelters in Scandinavia for centuries, lattice with multiple reindeer hide layers. Mongolian Jairs use felt layers with air gaps. The Inuit obviously understand insulation principles with igloos, ice blocks with trapped air. This isn't new knowledge. It's old knowledge that prospectors dismissed because it didn't look like a proper cabin. The accusation was gentle, but it landed. The camp had rejected Ericsson's design, not because they'd analyzed it and found it wanting, but because it didn't match their preconception of what a winter shelter should look like. Logs and stone looked substantial, permanent, strong. Canvas looked temporary, weak, insufficient. But physics didn't care about appearances. By January 16th, Prospectors had asked Ericsson for detailed plans. By January 20th, two had started building modified versions, not pure copies since canvas was now scarce in camp, but hybrid designs using some of his principles. Double-walled cabins with large air gaps. Rock heating systems with extended thermal mass. Dome-shaped roofs instead of standard peaked roofs. Thomas Reeves, to his credit, made a public statement on January 22nd. He gathered men at the camp's trading post and said simply, "I told Lars Ericsson his shelter wouldn't work. I was wrong. Not just a little wrong, completely wrong. He's warmer, using less fuel, and he'll outlast all of us. Anyone interested in surviving next winter should pay attention." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was honest. And honesty, in a place where wrong assumptions could kill you, mattered more than pride. The temperature finally broke on January 27th, rising to a comparatively balmy 12 below zero. Across 40 Mile, men assessed their wood supplies and realized many wouldn't make it to spring without resupply. The cold snap had burned through their reserves at an unsustainable rate. Ericsson, burning 20 pounds per day versus the camp average of 110 pounds, had consumed roughly 15% of his winter supply. He'd make it through March with wood to spare. The 45-degree difference wasn't just a comfort metric. For some men, it would be the difference between making it through winter and not making it at all. February 1898. Word traveled faster than sleds. The Yukon wasn't isolated. It was connected by a network of trails, trading posts, and camps where information moved with surprising speed. A technique that kept a man warm at 40 below using 1/5 the firewood? That wasn't just interesting. That was survival currency. By mid-February, prospectors from camps 30 miles away started appearing at 40 Mile specifically to see Ericsson's shelter. They'd heard the stories that sounded too good to be true, and needed to verify with their own eyes and thermometers. Samuel Hutchins arrived on February 14th from a camp near 60 Mile River. He'd lost 2 toes to frostbite in January when his cabin's temperature dropped to 19 degrees during a night when his fire went out. He was done trusting traditional methods. Ericsson walked him through the entire system, holding nothing back. The layer spacing, the rock selection, the dome geometry, the entrance tunnel design that prevented cold air intrusion. Hutchins took notes with fingers still bandaged from frostbite, asking questions that showed he understood the principles. The canvas treatment. What exactly did you use? Linseed oil, 3 parts. Pine resin, 1 part. Heated together until the resin dissolves, then applied hot to the canvas. Creates a waterproof barrier that stays flexible in cold. Standard tar or pitch gets brittle and cracks at these temperatures. The birch poles for the frame. How did you bend them without breaking? Cut them green in September, when the wood still has moisture. Bend them gradually over a form. Tie them in position. Let them dry for 2 weeks. Once they cure in that shape, they'll hold it permanently. Hutchins nodded, scribbling. And you're willing to share all this? Why wouldn't I be? Ericsson seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. A warmer camp is a safer camp. Nobody benefits from men freezing. The Norwegian's generosity was noted and remembered. But more than that, his willingness to teach created a cascade effect. Men who learned from Ericsson taught others. The knowledge didn't stay proprietary. It became communal, adapted, and modified for different situations. By late February, variations of Ericsson's design were appearing across the region. The Miller hybrid, Miller's Creek. March 1898, traditional log cabin exterior, but with a canvas inner wall creating a single 6-inch air gap around the entire living space. Increased the cabin's effective R value from 12 to approximately 24. Interior temperature rose by 18 degrees compared to standard construction. The Dawson Dome, Dawson City, March 1898, full dome construction using Ericsson's principles. but substituted caribou hides for some canvas layers. Achieved similar thermal performance with locally available materials. The Peterson double wall, Fort Emile, February 1898, kept his existing log cabin but added an outer canvas shell with 4-inch air gap. Reduced wood consumption by 40%, raised interior temperature by 12 degrees. Each adaptation proved the underlying physics. Trapped air layers worked. Controlled thermal mass worked. The specific materials mattered less than understanding the principles. Thomas Reeves, who'd been the most vocal skeptic initially, became one of the most vocal advocates. On March 3rd, he organized a community meeting at 40 Mile's largest cabin, Murphy's Place, which could hold 25 men if they packed in. 37 men showed up. They stood in shifts, rotating through to hear Reeves speak. "I'm going to say something that's hard for men like us," Reeves began. "We were wrong. Not about fireplaces being important, not about needing shelter, but about assuming that the way we'd always done things was the only way, the best way." He gestured to Erickson, who stood in the back looking uncomfortable with the attention. Lars didn't invent new physics. He didn't discover some secret nobody knew. He just paid attention to knowledge that already existed, knowledge we'd ignored because it came from cultures we didn't respect or methods we didn't understand. The admission resonated. These were practical men, not ideologues. They cared about what worked, and the evidence was overwhelming. Erickson's method worked better than traditional methods. Significantly better. Measurably better. The meeting turned into an impromptu engineering workshop. Men shared their own observations, their modifications, their failures and successes. Someone had tried building a dome, but made the air gaps too small, only 1 inch, and didn't see much improvement. Erickson explained that gaps below 2 inches allowed too much conductive heat transfer. The sweet spot was 2 to 3 inches for optimal still air insulation. Another man had tried heating rocks, but piled them directly against his cabin's wooden wall, creating a fire hazard. Erickson sketched out safe configurations, emphasizing clearance distances and metal shielding. By the end of March, a rough census showed results. 23 cabins in 40 Mile had implemented some version of Erickson's principles: average temperature increase, 16 degrees Fahrenheit average wood consumption decrease, 35% zero additional frostbite cases among men in modified shelters, 3 lives potentially saved, men who would have run out of firewood otherwise. But the impact reached beyond immediate survival metrics. The psychological effect mattered too. Men who'd spent January and February in constant discomfort, wearing every layer they owned indoors, burning through wood with growing anxiety. These men now had comfortable living spaces. They could remove their coats inside. They could work on equipment repairs without numbed fingers. They could sleep through the night without waking every 2 hours to feed fires. Morale transformed. A warm cabin wasn't just physically safer, it was mentally sustainable. Before we continue to the conclusion, I need you to do something. If this story has taught you anything valuable about survival, about questioning assumptions, or about respecting knowledge from unexpected sources, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're uncovering forgotten survival wisdom that could literally save lives. And drop a comment telling me, what primitive or old-fashioned technique have you seen that actually works better than modern methods? I read every single comment. The spring of 1898 brought the inevitable question. Would anyone maintain these modifications after winter ended, or would the camp revert to traditional methods once the crisis passed? The answer came in September 1898, when new prospectors arrived for the following winter. Veterans who'd survived the previous winter were offering advice. And that advice now included detailed instructions on multi-layer insulation and thermal mass systems. Several men had already started building improved shelters before the first frost, incorporating lessons learned. Jack Bradley, who'd been Erickson's neighbor and first convert, built a new cabin that combined log construction with Erickson's principles. Solid log walls for durability and protection, but with an inner canvas wall creating a managed air gap. A modified rock heating system integrated into a traditional fireplace. He called it the best of both worlds, and other men copied the design. By winter 1898 to 99, multi-layer insulation had become standard practice in 40 Mile, not an eccentric experiment. The technique had migrated to Dawson City, 60 Mile River, and camps along the Stewart and Klondike rivers. Estimates suggest that across the Yukon, over 200 shelters incorporated some version of Ericsson's thermal principles by the end of 1899. The Norwegians' canvas shelter itself became something of a landmark. Men would bring visitors by to see it, to feel the warmth radiating from those river stones, to understand that survival wasn't about brute force, but about intelligent application of basic physics. Ericsson stayed in the Yukon through 1902, did moderately well in his prospecting, then returned to Seattle. He never struck it rich in gold, but he'd contributed something more valuable than any individual claim: knowledge that kept men alive and comfortable through conditions that had killed others. The last recorded mention of his specific shelter appears in a journal entry for 1903, written by a prospector named William Chun. Stayed in the Norwegians' old dome shelter. Fire been out for years, but the structure still stands. Canvas weathered, but intact. You can still see the genius in how it was built. Made me think about how many good ideas we miss because they don't look the way we expect. The irony is sharp and uncomfortable. Lars Ericsson's shelter worked because he'd applied principles that were thousands of years old. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia had used layered hide shelters with air gaps for centuries. Mongolian nomads had perfected felt layer jairs that maintained warmth in steppe winters reaching 40 below. Indigenous peoples across the Arctic had developed dozens of insulation strategies that worked with natural materials and basic physics. This wasn't hidden knowledge. It wasn't secret. It was simply knowledge that frontiersmen, confident in their own experience, certain of their methods, had never bothered to examine. The term primitive carries assumptions. It suggests crude, inefficient, inferior. But primitive often meant refined over thousands of years through trial and error. The Inuit igloo, constructed from snow blocks, creates an interior environment that can be 60 degrees warmer than the exterior using only body heat and a small seal oil lamp. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated engineering using available materials. Ericsson's genius wasn't invention. It was translation. He took principles from multiple traditional sources, understood the underlying physics, and adapted them to prospector materials and conditions. His canvas came from general stores, not reindeer herds. His rocks came from rivers, not specialized quarries. But the core principles, layered insulation, trapped air, thermal mass, optimized geometry, these came directly from cultures that Euro-American frontiersmen had dismissed as backward. The prospectors of 40 Mile learned a lesson that extends far beyond shelter design. Dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. Consider the broader pattern. How many times has Western industrial culture discovered something that indigenous peoples had known for centuries? Controlled burns for forest management, used by Native Americans for thousands of years, dismissed by European foresters, finally rediscovered in the 1970s Chinampas floating gardens, used by Aztecs to create incredibly productive agriculture, ignored by Spanish colonizers, now studied as models for sustainable urban farming canid irrigation systems, used in Persia for 3,000 years to transport water without evaporation loss. Finally recognized as brilliant engineering in the 20th century, the pattern repeats because the underlying assumption repeats. If it's old, if it's from a non-industrial culture, if it doesn't look like modern solutions, it must be inferior. Ericsson's shelter proved the opposite. His 68-degree interior at 40 below, using 1/5 the fuel of a proper cabin, demonstrated that traditional knowledge wasn't a quaint historical curiosity. It was engineering that had been tested and refined across generations. The physics he employed are still valid. Modern construction has largely converged on his principles, though we use different materials. High-performance homes today use multi-layer wall systems with air gaps, exactly Ericsson's approach, thermal mass for heat storage, concrete floors, brick walls, same principle as his rocks, optimized geometry to minimize heat loss, though usually not domes due to construction complexity. R values of 40 plus 4 walls in cold climates, matching or slightly exceeding what Erickson achieved with canvas and air. We didn't invent these principles in the 21st century. We rediscovered them, and we rediscovered them later than we should have, because we dismissed the sources that had preserved them. There's a practical lesson here for anyone interested in survival, homesteading, or off-grid living. Look at what worked before industrial solutions. Not because old is automatically better, but because old methods that survive for centuries survive for reasons. They solved real problems with limited resources. Understanding why they worked gives you options that modern supply chains can't take away. Erickson's shelter worked in 1898, and a version of it would work today if you found yourself in a similar situation. Remote location, limited resources, extreme cold. The canvas might be modern synthetic fabric. The rocks might be selected with better knowledge of thermal properties, but the core system remains sound. The prospectors who mocked Erickson weren't stupid men. They were experienced, capable frontiersmen who'd survived conditions that would kill most modern people. But they'd made the mistake of confusing familiarity with correctness, of assuming that their way was the only viable way. When Jack Bradley finally admitted, "We were wrong," he wasn't just acknowledging Erickson's superior shelter. He was acknowledging a broader failure of intellectual humility. The willingness to assume that unfamiliar approaches must be inferior, that traditional methods from other cultures couldn't possibly have anything to teach experienced American frontiersmen. That assumption cost men comfort, fuel, and in some cases lives. It cost them months of unnecessary suffering through a winter that could have been far more bearable. The broader cost is harder to quantify, but perhaps more significant. How much knowledge have we lost because we dismissed it before we understood it? How many elegant solutions to environmental challenges, food preservation, water management, and resource efficiency were forgotten because they didn't fit industrial models? Some of that knowledge is being recovered. Ethnobotanists work with indigenous communities to document plant knowledge before elders pass away. Architects study vernacular building techniques to understand how pre-industrial peoples created comfortable living spaces in extreme climates. Agricultural researchers examine traditional farming methods that maintained soil fertility for centuries without synthetic inputs. But recovery is harder than preservation would have been. Every generation that passes takes oral knowledge with it. Every elder who dies without teaching the next generation represents a library burned. Erickson's story offers a counterpoint. It shows what happens when someone actually pays attention, when curiosity overcomes assumption. He looked at Sami shelters, Mongolian jars, and Arctic techniques, not with contempt, but with genuine interest in solving a problem. He asked, "Why does this work?" instead of "Why would anyone do it that way?" That question, "Why does this work?" is the foundation of actual learning as opposed to mere repetition of familiar patterns. The prospectors of 40 Mile eventually learned to ask that question. By the winter of 1898 to 99, men were experimenting with adaptations, testing variations, understanding principles rather than just copying methods. That's when traditional knowledge becomes truly valuable, when it's understood well enough to be adapted to new contexts. The canvas shelter itself is gone now, degraded by time and weather. But the principle it demonstrated remains. Intelligence isn't about having the latest technology or the most expensive materials. Intelligence is about understanding what you're trying to achieve and finding the most effective way to achieve it with what you have. Sometimes that means looking forward to new innovations. Sometimes it means looking back to old wisdom. Most often, it means combining both with humility about what we don't know and curiosity about what we might learn. Lars Erickson kept men warm through a Yukon winter that could have killed them. But his real contribution was demonstrating that wisdom doesn't have a timestamp. Good ideas remain good ideas whether they're 3,000 years old or invented yesterday. The question is whether we're humble enough to recognize them. If this story made you think differently about traditional knowledge, about survival wisdom, or about questioning your assumptions, do me one final favor. Hit that like button, Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten survival techniques that actually work, and drop a comment answering this. What's one piece of old-fashioned advice you initially dismissed but later realized was absolutely right? I want to hear your stories. And remember, the warmest shelter isn't always the one that looks the strongest. Sometimes it's the one built by someone who understood that pride freezes faster than canvas.